Okay, so we are live now, and I'm doing a sound and a check, picture check, so I get the confirmation. Are we getting the sound?
Okay, I'm better talking, then you can hear me. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Level is fine?
Are you getting the sound? Okay, so
Okay.
we have got the sound and the picture, so we'll begin.
Good.
So, yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's actually good evening in Australia. And welcome to today's conversation on the origins and development of Australian literature. We are indeed lucky to have with us Paul Sharrad. So let me begin by introducing our honorable guest. Paul Sharrad began his career as a lecturer in English at the University of Wollongong in 1987, beginning a 27-year career with the university that culminated in his appointment as associate professor in 2000 and senior fellow in 2014. Though he retired from the university in mid-2014, he continues to research and write and to champion the university's reputation and external engagement. He shaped research, teaching, and administration through a number of executive roles, including head of department, head of postgraduate studies, and associate dean research, and through his contributions to numerous committees at faculty and university level. Paul is internationally renowned for his research in the field of English literature, a world-leading expert in post-colonial literary study and writing. He was at the forefront of developing post-colonial studies in Australia. As a researcher, Paul's body of work is extensive and authoritative. He has authored 3 books on Indian English fiction, 67 book chapters and 71 journal articles, and co-edited countless other written works. He has delivered in excess of 100 conference papers internationally and been a visiting lecturer and fellow at universities in Europe, North America, and Asia. Building deep connections across national boundaries for scholarly exchange, curriculum development, conferences, and publication is a hallmark of Paul's career. He has forged deep connections across the South Pacific, United Kingdom, Europe, and the Americas to foster and advance post-colonial studies globally. He has acted as reader for respected international scholarly journals and publishers, and a judge for many creative writing prizes, and organized the International Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Beyond this, he has organized donations of library books for earthquake-damaged campuses in Pakistan, school supplies for tsunami-ravaged Samoa, and Australian study resources for Indian libraries. It is indeed a privilege to have Paul Sharrad here with us today. A very warm welcome to you, sir. And thank you for accepting my invitation to be on this.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Dr. Banerjee, and hello to everybody.
So now let us move on to the conversation. And my first question to you would be, speaking in very broad terms, Australian literature is believed to have begun with the advent of the European settlers to the island. To be even more specific, Australian literature came into existence after the first fleet sailed into New South Wales in 1788. Now, this despite the fact that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia have been telling stories since time immemorial. So was it only because these stories and legends constituted an oral tradition that they were dismissed? And if so, is non-writing a valid reason for categorically dismissing it as the origin of Australian literature? Your views on that, sir?
Okay, thanks. It's certainly true that Australia as a continent has a cultural tradition. Some say the earliest human cultural tradition continuing back to 65,000 years ago. The problem, I think, is a technical one in terms of terminology about what is Australian literature, and that has been defined by the Academy. And there are various things by that. I mean, it's mostly meant written up until recent times, really. It's also been divided so that a lot of the oral culture has been looked at under different aegises such as anthropology rather than English where most of our literature in Australia certainly is studied. So there is that definitional distinction, I suppose. The other thing is that there are huge cultural differences between the Aboriginal traditions and the white settler traditions. Of course, you can't have Australian literature until Australia comes into existence, and for the vast length of cultural transmission for Aboriginal society, Australia wasn't Australia, it was Gondwana or somewhere like that. Australia didn't exist until 1901, technically. So at that point, of course, literature was defined by the dominant population, which was numerically white and British. So there is that again, slight definitional problem that Australian literature has meant the literature of the nation, and that has been dominated historically by a white settler population. That has certainly excluded Aboriginal culture for a very long time, except as an anthropological study. Certainly once there was a lot of interest in Aboriginal culture. Way back in the 19th century, Langlo Parker, collected myths and legends, and David Inaipon became famous in the 1920s and 30s for collecting his particular legends and writing them down. So from that moment, you might say that there was an Aboriginal literature, as written literature, entering into the dominant national cultural space. But it took a long time for a major literary presence to be recognised from the Aboriginal side of the population, and that really didn't start happening until the 60s and even later in anthologies. There are other issues that, because of oral tradition, a lot of the narrative and even the conceptual bases of story in Aboriginal culture is quite distinct from what anyone within English literature would understand as a literary culture. A lot of it is, of course, not in English, which is something that has prevented the majority population from having access to for a very long time. And also a lot of it is parceled out to ownership, if you like, of individuals across the whole continent. So little bits of stories in a particular space are the property of a particular custodian. And for other people, those stories are secret. So again, in that context, it's been problematic, if you like, for Aboriginal literature as a whole thing to gain access to or be recognised by the dominant literary culture of the nation. Things are changing, but again, people insist on that kind of cultural difference which sets them apart, and a lot of people do not want, in fact, the dominant culture to, as it were, appropriate, take over, misrepresent, and take away the voice, if you like, of the owners of that culture. So that's part of the story. It's changing. There's a lot more recognition of Aboriginal culture and cultural tradition, including in language, the many languages of Aboriginal cultures. So things are changing.
Fine. So now my next question would be, the free settlers arrived in Australia only from 1793 onwards. That is 5 years after the first fleet sailed into New South Wales. And now both the convicts and the free settlers were intrigued by the unique flora and fauna of the island. And yet, they saw it as a hostile place of exile far away from home. So the early European settlers in Australia were torn between two strong influences, the uniqueness of the land and the melancholy of the exile. Now, which, according to you, was the stronger of the two, and how did it influence the society, the early society?
I think the two have always run in tandem, really. And it depends very much on who we're talking about, how strong the sense of exile is. Obviously, for the Aboriginal population, there was no sense of exile, and the natural landscape was very much a familiar one. But for the white settlers, And I think you mentioned the free settlers.
Yes.
The pre-free settlers are a distinct quality in Australian society and history, which have to be kept very much in mind, that Australia was founded as a colony, as a prison, which makes a huge difference from thinking about American literature, where the myth of the Pilgrim Fathers and beyond is the myth of finding the promised land and a freedom and opportunity, etc. Everyone can become a millionaire. Australia was never like that. And there is, I mean, not all parts of Australia were convict settlements. I was born in Adelaide, which was a free settlement. So there are cultural differences internally, but that sense of a past dominated by the fact that nobody came here willingly, not even the soldiers who were guarding the prisoners, they were sent by the government. So for a very long time, at least, most people who were here did not want to be here. But also, even amongst those early convicts and so forth, not all of them had a sense of exile and longing for the homeland, because many of them were quite happy to get away from the homeland, which had, after all, imprisoned them for very trivial offences or for political offences if you're Irish. I mean, if we go to even as late as my parents, my mother, her parents were English. They migrated from England. She went back to England during the Depression, so they still thought of England as very much at least an alternative home, if not actual home. And people of that generation, certainly culturally, and again, we're talking about white settler people, thought of the British Isles as a home from which they were separated, culturally at least. The cultural authority came from the colonial metropolis in Britain. So there was that sense of exile. But in practical terms, there was that doubleness. I can actually give you a couple of examples from poetry where, and of course, Australia is referred to as the Antipodes in many places, and that means the opposite feet or the opposite ends of the earth. Australia was seen as being the opposite of Europe. Even the animals were seen as some sort of travesty, if you like, of European animals. And nature, as you say, was seen by many, certainly in the early days, as very unfamiliar and a place where you could die. So there is this bush ballad by a chap called Barcroft Boak, and it starts off, out in the wastes of the Never Never. The Never Never is like the dry desert inland of the country. That's where the dead men lie. That's where the heat waves dance forever. That's where the dead men lie. That's where the earth's loved sons are keeping endless tryst, nor the west wind sweeping feverish pinions can wake their sleeping. Out where the dead men lie. And it goes through summer, floods, fire, everything that can kill you. On the other hand, you find somebody like Banjo Patterson. Some of you might have heard of him for The Man from Snowy River. He has a poem called Clancy of the Overflow. The Overflow being that riverine country to the north of New South Wales, south of Queensland. Clancy has gone droving, that is herding cattle. And most of Australia, in fact, you have to remember, was a wandering society. Not just the Aborigines, but the white settlers were wandering all over the countryside, herding cattle, herding sheep, walking to the gold fields somewhere and then walking somewhere else when the gold ran out. So it takes a long time for the nation to settle. But in this poem, you have the poet sitting, as he says, in my dingy little office where a stingy ray of sunlight struggles feebly down between the houses tall. So he's in the city, working in an office, and he dreams of his friend Clancy, who's gone droving. And he says, Clancy, the stock are slowly stringing, Clancy rides beside them singing, for the drover's life has pleasures that the townfolk never know. And the bush has friends to meet him, and their kindly voices greet him in the murmur of the breezes and the river on its bars. And he sees the vision splendid of the sunlit plains extended, and at night the wondrous glory of the everlasting stars. So you have these two absolutely contradictory visions of the Australian geographical space, the land of promise and the land of threat and alienation. And that runs pretty much in tandem through Australian literary culture for a very long time. And the other thing that's interesting about the Clancy poem is the fact that the poet is writing from the city, that Australia has always been, in population terms, contrary to the popular mythology, an urban city culture. The population lives on the coast, in the cities, Melbourne, Sydney, etc. But the mythology is all these wandering people with sheep and cattle and so forth in the bush, in the interior. So there's a kind of cultural contradiction there, and it takes a very long time for Australian literature to really catch up with the fact that the city is the place where most people actually live and where cultural practice happens. So, yes, I mean, the uniqueness of the land defined Australia as opposed to Europe. And the closer to the land you could get, the more Australian you became, in a sense. But at the same time, culturally, for the white population, the language, the literature emanated from Britain. Australia was a colony, secondary to British culture, and in that sense, it was always a culture of exile until people learned to imagine themselves independently of those cultural references to any other origin. And it's a historical generational thing in many senses. Okay, we might move on from there.
Yeah, so you have talked about poetry, city, the bush poetry and all. So my next question would be, genre-wise, poetry was the first to evolve, followed by the novel and then the dramas. Some of the early poets, beginning with Michael Macy Robinson, who was incidentally the first poet to be published in Australia, and people like George Barrington and Francis McNamara, popularly known as Frank the Poet, that you just mentioned, laid the foundation of the rich poetic traditions of Australia. Now, would you tell us a little more about this early poetry?
Sure. We can actually go back and think about the question about orality of the first question too here, because yes, for a very long time, all Australian literature was oral, except for a few soldiers who were writing memoirs and what have you. A lot of Australians were actually illiterate and remained so for quite a long time. Bearing in mind that the convicts were quite often from the lower ends of society and you know, were there for stealing handkerchiefs and poaching rabbits and so forth in order to survive. So what you have in poetry begins in the Western tradition as song, as recited poetry. It still, in popular tradition, does happen. You still go to a pub and find somebody who can recite by memory the entire Man from Snowy River or something like that. But of course, most poets do write these days and started writing quite early, certainly started recording the oral traditions very early. So the sorts of things you get, the bush ballads, the ballads about the shearers, the drovers, often celebrating the wonderful life to be, you know, out in the fresh air and wandering around. A lot of convict poems, protesting about the poor conditions, forced labour, etc. Poetry about later on about the gold rushes. So just to give you a quick taste, a sample early song, Tasmania used to be called Van Diemen's Land because it was hit upon by a Dutchman at one point before the British got there. There's a song about Van Diemen's Land which starts off, come all ye rambling boys and take to you good care. When you go a-hunting with your dogs, your hounds, your snares. Watch out for the gamekeeper, keep your dogs at your command, and think of all the hardships going to Van Diemen's Land. So this guy goes poaching, as you know, catching game that he wasn't supposed to have. He gets sent for 7 years out to Australia. And the second verse is, the minute we were landed all on that fatal shore, the planters, they inspected us full 20 score or more. They marched us round like horses and sold us out of hand, and yoked us to the plough, brave boys, to plough Van Diemen's land. So you have a very clear picture of an unhappy place.
Yes.
People who are treated as slaves, treated as forced labour, and so forth, and a lot of poems like that, which of course produce those rebel poems as well, with figures like Ned Kelly and Ben Hall, the Bushrangers, rebelling against that kind of treatment. Poems about the gold rushes become much more positive, particularly Irish ones. Coming out to Australia, as let me think of the verse. It says, and when I reach Australia, it's there I'll look for gold. There's plenty there for picking up, or so I have been told. Or maybe I'll go back to my trade. 500 bricks I'll lay for an 8-hour shift for an 8-bob grift on the shores of Botany Bay. Botany Bay being the Sydney settlement. So this is an Irishman, and he gets sick of his job in England, goes out to Australia as a free settler. And the interesting thing about that is the 8-hour shift for an 8-bob grift, 8 shillings pay, right? Because Australia became, for many, what was known as the working man's paradise. It became a social welfare state, very interested in being a classless society and everybody having a fair go, as it were, as a result of which early legislation was passed that you could work, the average worker would work legally 8 hours a day and get a basic wage. You could not go below, a certain level of pay, which of course wasn't the case in England at the time. So at that point, Australia becomes a land of potential promise for many, and the poetry reflects that. Have we got out of the early poetry? I think. The other major shift in the early poetry becomes when land management gets changed. The early landowners, the early people who occupied land, they were given land by the government, and they were given vast acres of land, the size of small countries elsewhere. And they were known as squatters because they didn't actually pay for anything, but they owned these huge estates of agricultural prospects. That changed when those big estates were broken up, and those free settlers that you mentioned had to be given a living, so they were able to buy smaller lots and take up fruit farming or vegetable growing and so forth, and they were known as cockies. So a lot of the poems deal with this clash between the cockies and the squatters, the ordinary everyman and the rich landed gentry. And again, you get these cultural myths that Australia is a classless society, and certainly compared to England it was. Nobody paid huge respect to an aristocracy. The closest to an aristocracy was the squatter, but there was just privilege by virtue of land ownership and money. Once the cockies came in, there was this rivalry, and certainly more and more work shifted to the smallholder and to the city, and the squatters became fewer. They're still very influential here and there, but fewer and further between than they used to be. So there was a cultural shift, and the class system became quite significant in poetry as well as prose. Okay,
so that was wonderful songs coming from you and recitations. I mean, lovely. Moving on, what I want to ask you is that the other phases that follow the early Australian poetry were the bush ballads, the poetry of the Jilly Vorobak and the Angry Penguin movements, Aboriginal poetry, that is 1960 onwards, and the experimental verses of the 1980s and 90s, and the poetry after the 1990s by poets like Faye Wiki, Robert Stiles, and Billy Marshall. What were the major themes and characteristics of the poets during these phases? If you could please give us a brief outline.
It'll be a very thumbnail sketch because there are so many poets. Everybody writes poetry, even if it doesn't get published. So we can make some broad outlines. Of course, the first poets really were nature poets, trying to come to grips with where they were, with the landscape, with the flora and fauna. So one of the early celebrated poems is by a chap called Henry Kendall, who was a currency boy, meaning he was locally born, not coming out from Britain, and grew up amongst Australian nature. He has a poem called Bellbirds. It was actually written just about 20 miles down the coast from where I am in Wollongong. And it talks about bellbirds, who are the native wildlife. They have this bell note, very musical. And the poem uses British forms, obviously, because it's in English and that's what he reads, but it locates poetry in the Australian landscape and celebrates particularly Australian wildlife in a very rhythmic, musical way. So that how to talk about strange creatures and strange vegetation, and make the local landscape at home in literature, becomes the earliest perhaps phase. Another phase is a sort of philosophy push, so that you have more or less a generation or two later than Kendall, poets like Kenneth Slessor, R.D. Fitzgerald, who are talking about time and history. Now, this is in a country which culturally was deemed not to have a history, was without a literary tradition. So finding a local history became important. Finding forebears, if you like, that would give you a basis for feeling Australian and for writing about Australia becomes important. So you get a lot of poems about the early explorers, what Douglas Stewart called Voyager poems. Macaulay wrote a poem about Fernando de Queiroz, the Spanish explorer, whom some believe set foot in Australia, but most don't, sailing across the Pacific in search of the Great South Land. Slessor himself wrote 5 visions of Captain Cook. Captain Cook, of course, being the white sailor who did hit the Australian coast and explored most of the eastern coasts, and was therefore fundamental in getting a colony set up here. And Slessor's, he recreates, if you like, the voyage of Cook, the scientific experiments that Cook was carrying out, or his crew were carrying out, and finishes up, because Cook sailed this way around the world, poets now write in Australia. So you can see he's kind of creating this validation for his own literary expression as an Australian rather than as a British person. Fitzgerald talks again about some of the early explorers, Tasman, the Dutch explorer, but also about time and about history and about human agency in history. What does it mean to settle a new country? What does it mean to have your forebears involved in the treatment of convicts? What we used to call the convict stain? Do you inherit a kind of criminal personality? Does the culture have a fundamental flaw if it has an origin in something other than a kind of French Revolution optimistic idealism? And he grapples with that question, but very much with the sense of you make your own fortune. The actor in history is the triumphal person of creating a new nation. And then you get people like A.D. Hope, who's an academic, who's much more tied into British literature, who takes some of these questions with a sort of comic satiric look, and says, well, they call Australia a new land, right? But they lie. It's as old as the hills, partly thinking about Aboriginal tradition as well. So Australia has this double aspect. There is promise, but it's also a promise which is open to question. So that sense of the nation comes to play, trying to underpin the nation with a history, with a philosophy, with ideas, rather than just a place where you come to make a living and so forth. Over time, what can we say? Well, certainly over time, you get a book like this, if I can wave it. Even there we go, The New Australian Poetry, 1979. That really marks several shifts. It marks a shift from British culture to American culture, if you like, from a literary voice to a more popular voice, the sort of language everybody speaks now in the street rather than what Wordsworth or somebody spoke on paper. And a sense of mixing a world culture as part of Australian culture, opening up the poetic forms into free verse, into open-spaced verse, particularly according to American models. So that's, and thinking of poetry as language and language play, not so much about a form into which you bang content. So it's a construct. It's sort of moving into postmodern ideas of literature. So that's probably a major shift as well. You have people like Bruce Dorr and Alan Wern who are writing poems. Wern is a kind of modern day bush balladist, right? But writing in the city in the city context about yuppies, about upwardly mobile professionals, young people, how they live their lives, but in the old ballad forms, using a sort of modern day Australian English. And Bruce Dorr talking about the suburbs and Australian culture in that very localised sense, popular sense in a way. Again, more and more experimentation happens. An interesting one is this book, which I think you might be able to see if I hold.
No, could you just lift it up a bit? Could you just lift it up a bit? Yeah. Now it's
okay. Yeah. You can see the poetry. The poet is Dorothy Porter.
Dorothy Porter, yes.
Writes this book called The Monkey's Mask, and you can see it's got a woman's face with a piece of sticking paper over the eyes. And it's a quote from a poem. She's wearing a monkey's mask. It is a novel in verse, and it's a detective novel in verse. It's a murder mystery. So you can see how she's blending popular and high culture, poetry, prose, and a sort of postmodern technique where more or less the answer is in plain sight. You just have to keep looking for it under the surface of the text. So again, a very self-aware kind of literary construct, but also very readable poetry. And it became so unusually popular for an Australian poet, and they made a film out of it, a kind of murder mystery film, which of course you lose half the poetry in that. So that's a kind of quick outline. I haven't mentioned key people like Judith Wright, for example, who's written over almost a century, and her poetry changes over time as well. All right.
Okay, so we move on from poetry to novels. Now, like poetry, the Australian novel too, I believe, had its origin in the expression of the latent feelings of the convict. In 1931, the first Australian novel to be written and published in Australia, Quintus Survinton, a tale founded upon incidents of real occurrences, came out. It was actually, I believe, by Henry Savory, convict, and it was a thinly veiled autobiography. Since then, there have been numerous writers and change of perspectives, from viewing Australia as a savage land from the perspective of the European eye, to the rise of nationalistic feelings, and then the portrayal of social realism, that is after the formation of the Federation in 1901. These were again followed by writers like Vance Farmer after the repression of the 1930s, followed by the Nobel laureate Patrick White, later David Malouf, and then the contemporary Peter Carey and Kerry Greenwood. Now, could you please analyze the major themes and influences of these writers? I mean, obviously the names are just indicative. You are free to, add to them or ignore any of them.
All righty. Following very much the same lines as the poetry, in fact, what we didn't talk about in the poetry, which we probably should just reprise for a minute, was the Jindi Warabaks. because that takes us back to the very first question about Aboriginal culture. These were poets in the 1930s, early 40s, who tried to, again, localise Australian poetry as Australian by plugging into images from Aboriginal culture. It was an interesting experiment, and most people see it as being a rather failed experiment, simply because it was a bit like window dressing. Certainly at that point, most people had no contact, most white people anyway, had no contact with Aboriginal culture. So it didn't really mean a lot, culturally speaking, to throw in some Aboriginal words, which most people wouldn't have known the meaning of, including sometimes the poets themselves. So it sounded good. And it was important in asserting that we are not British, we have a place somewhere else at the other side of the world with a different cultural base. And it did introduce some Aboriginal ideas into white cultural space, which prepared the way, if you like, for the emergence of Aboriginal writers later on. So that's important, and it feeds into where we go with, I think, a later question about modernism. But in terms of prose, you do begin, obviously, with explorers' diaries, with people writing about their experiences of settlement as a novel thing, finding out about who the local people were, what the wildlife was, how to survive in Australia in a different climate. Lots of stories and yarns describing local life, describing the fact that Christmas was in midsummer and not with snow, etc. So you start out with people like Marcus Clarke writing about the terrible experiences of the convict years. You have somebody like Rolf Boldrewood writing a book called Robbery Under Arms, which was a adventure romance, making the bushranger into a popular Robin Hood kind of hero. And this was very popular reading back in England as well, obviously thinking about the exotic parts of the world and what adventures you could have if you went to Australia, fighting bushfires and surviving floods, etc., etc. You even find that in The Tree of Man by Patrick White many, many years later, which is full of floods and fires and survival of a pioneering generation. The big novel, I suppose, in early times was The Fortunes of Richard Marney by Henry Handel Richardson, which is the story of an Irish doctor who leaves England, partly because he's Irish and they don't treat him very well in England. He doesn't feel at home there. Comes out to Victoria, to the goldfields, is not all that effective, perhaps as a doctor, but makes a sort of living supplying tools to the gold miners. Makes enough money to go back to England, where again he's treated as a colonial, and this becomes the sort of doubled experience of the white Australian, that they are colonising a country, taking over someone else's country, but they are also regarded as colonials by the British, as second-class citizens, as, you know, you go to England, you can even still and say, oh, I'm from Australia, and they say, oh, you speak English really well, in tones of surprise. So there's this sense of migration, of being overseas, being somewhere else, but that somewhere else gradually becoming home. And in the end, Richard Marney comes back to Australia for the second time. So migration remains very much part of the Australian story. There's a tradition, I suppose, against that Richard Marney story, which is a realist story, the sort of 19th century novel you would recognise anywhere, with just happens to have an Australian setting, character study. Against that, you have a book like Such is Life by Joseph Furphy, or Tom Collins is his pen name, which is a kind of philosophical, spoofy wandering country folk of bullock teams and shearers having adventures, getting things wrong, making mistakes, thinking they're philosophers who are quoting Shakespeare and Plato all the time out in the bush. It's a very humorous book, partly because the narrator thinks he knows everything and is constantly getting things wrong. And that becomes the sort of other side of the Australian literary tradition in prose that leads up to something like Peter Carey's Illiwacker much later on. Again, a kind of humorous spoof of a mix of popular history and official history and tall tales, again, from the bush, but also from modern Australia, with a sense of Australia having this overseas cultural tradition to draw on, but making it local, and in Carey's tradition of Australia becoming potentially a new colony under globalization and American cultural imperialism. So there's that tradition, if you like, of an ongoing tradition of colonialist influence, which we'll come back to later on, I suspect. Yeah. I'm just going to turn the light on because it's getting dark here and I can barely see.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
There we go. Now I can read my notes. And you mentioned social realism. There was also a spin-off from that, socialist realism, and that is in the Depression, the late 20s, 30s. Again, that sense of a class in Australia becomes important, and many people join the Communist Party, speaking out on behalf of the ideal society for the working person, where there's equal pay for everybody and so on and so forth. So you get people like Catherine Susanna Pritchard, Working Bullocks, one of her early novels, which is describing life of working timber cutters and teamsters in the bush, how hard the labour conditions are, how people get ripped off by the employers and so forth. She also writes Coonadoo, which was a very scandalous story at the time about white relations with Aboriginal women. And somebody like Dimsna Cusack, again from the left, writing about the industrialising of Australian society and the role of the workers in factories, the health system in Australia, and how important it was to have, good hospitals for ordinary people, not just for the rich. Dorothy Hewitt writes a book called Bobbin' Up about women working in a spinning factory in Sydney, and again the working class conditions there, and how women survive and produce, if you like, a sort of counterculture of their own. So this goes right through the 1930s into the 1940s. Very strong social conscience, almost sometimes documentary fiction about Australian life. And then you get the artistic generation, if you like. The writers who are starting to introduce poetic techniques into prose, who want to be recognised by Europe sometimes as artistic, certainly as worthy of the Nobel Prize in Patrick White's case, taking on modernist techniques. So Patrick White, Randolph Stowe, Christopher Koch, the early Tom Keneally, writing very poetic, highly metaphoric prose with chopped up sentences, following the rhythms of Virginia Woolf, for example. Again, a sort of psychological realism in one sense. So that Voss, for example, is semi-symbolist, semi-fantastical, but is also psychologically interested in the mental state of the willpower that drives somebody who's willing to put his life on the line and wander off into the unknown bush, and in fact, meet an untimely end there. So all of these things are happening. All these phases overlap, and you finish up with you mention in your list, I think, sir, of Kerry Greenwood, who is symptomatic, if you like, of the shift towards increasingly towards a middle brow or popular culture, or recognition of genre fiction within the literary circle, if you like. She writes, particularly her most popular series is about a woman called Phryne Fisher in 1920s Melbourne. They're very popular culture murder mystery stories, but set strongly within a historical, recognisable historical and Melbourne Victorian Australian setting. Also interesting because Phryne has her origins as a World War I nurse of British upper class background who comes to Australia and really provokes everybody by renouncing her class and playing across all the classes, but also historically making clear, and this is, I think, where we're heading, that Australian society was never entirely white or never entirely Anglo, because her boyfriend becomes a Chinese chap, and he's a Chinese who has, his family's been there since the goldfields in the 1850s. The goldfields were really a turning point. As a quick example, that 1858, which is sort of early-ish in the goldfield period, Australia made it to 1 million people. And again, this is something that the Indian student needs to remember. Australia still only has 25 million people. For a long time, it had very, very few people, full stop. But because of the goldfields, that 1 million became 2 million by 1881. So in 30 years, you've doubled the national population, which was a huge, huge shift. And of course, nearly all those people, if not all of them, were free settlers, not convicts. So the social fabric changes radically. And again, they came from everywhere. There are stories of the goldfields where Red Indians from America are wandering around the goldfields in their moccasins. Maoris from New Zealand are on the goldfields, and so on and so forth. Where do we finish up? We finish up with a lot of people writing fiction these days, and the literary field becoming very, very wide indeed. Increasingly middlebrow because of the way publishing goes. You have to be able to make money for a publisher to get published or to continue to be published. So the more popular you are, the better they like you. But if you can also be literary as well, then so much the better. So somebody like Patrick White, who is high-end literary, gets the Nobel Prize, but sort of goes in and out of fashion and certainly isn't read by everybody in Australia. I remember there was an Indian student who wrote an article about Patrick White, which begins, Patrick White was a difficult man who wrote difficult books, which is a fair summation. But like most writers, you have to read through his oeuvre to get used to what he's doing in order to then understand what he's doing and what he's doing with language as well. So yes, things become more and more complicated over time. Okay, we should move on because time is running out, and I think you wanted to get to some later questions.
Yeah, sure. So we're moving on. Australianness, within quotes, seems to be at the very heart of Australian literature. Now, my question is, what were the different phases of the concept of Australianness from 1778 to the present day? And what did it encompass, and how did it evolve?
Okay, I've touched on a little bit about this in terms of coming to terms with the landscape and so forth. I mean, if you think about it, and some of these questions overlap with Indian writing and English as well. How do you distinguish a local writing in a global language? So how do you distinguish Australian literature as opposed to any other literature in English? Well, there is language. The Australian idiom is no longer the same thing as British idiom, even though it draws on it. Nor is it the same as American idiom, even though increasingly, my grandchildren are learning English off YouTube, which is mostly American. Nature obviously defines Australia. Aboriginal culture defines Australia as being different from Europe. Classlessness and other such myths help to define Australia as being different, even though they are often myths. So for a start, one of the things that starts to define Australian national culture, if you like, is the idea of mateship. Again, it goes back to the idea that to survive in the bush, you need a mate or two or three, because if you're on your own, you're going to die. And that mateship spreads over into the working class ethos that Australia is, a working class country, and workers stick by their mates, which has a lot to do with the strong sporting tradition as well. Your mates are part of the same team and you support each other, with the idea of the fair go. So all of this still runs through at least the rhetoric of what it is to be Australian, even though the fair go in Australia is put to the test in all sorts of different ways these days. The quintessential shift for most historians and popular culture people is the First World War, where you had soldiers going off to fight because they belonged to the British Empire, as did many Indians, in fact, because they saw it as an adventure and a free trip overseas, if nothing else, and finding themselves fighting alongside and sometimes under the command of British soldiers, who were very much the officer class from the gentry in England, speaking a very toffy English accent, coming up against ordinary Australians who saw themselves as being classless and as good as anybody else, who would take no nonsense from people they saw as putting on airs and looking down upon them. So if somebody who came from a British, college somewhere said, "Right, you lot, we're going over the front, over the top, and walking up this hill towards a machine gun emplacement," the Australians said, "No, we're not going to do it that way." And of course, some of them got court-martialed. But there was this sense of suddenly realizing that, yes, we come from a British Empire, but we are not British anymore. We don't think the same way as some of these guys. And we're really Australian. And of course, that gets even more consolidated in the Second World War, when the British really gave up on Singapore and the Middle East in order to fight their own war in Europe, and wanted Australian troops to be sent to Europe when Australia was being invaded by the Japanese. And the Prime Minister had to say to Churchill, "No, we want our own soldiers to fight out for our own country." So there was a radical move against Britain politically at that point. And it's at that point too where Australia suddenly finds itself with American troops in Darwin, in Brisbane, and other parts around, fighting alongside Australians and bringing in a whole new culture and popular culture that they hadn't been fully exposed to previously. And from that time on, obviously Hollywood starts to feed into Australia, so people start imagining themselves much more in American terms rather than British terms. And so it goes on. And then, of course, Britain joins the European Common Market and leaves its trading partners in the colonies to fend for themselves. So that's where Australianism goes. Again, the Second World War is a major shift in population because people bring in, the government starts to bring in Europeans, Italians, Greeks, Dutch, Germans, Poles, etc. And the cultural nature of society, the ethnic nature of society, the linguistic nature of society starts to change quite significantly. Certainly the culinary side of Australian society changes, where the old British roast beef and roast lamb and mashed potato suddenly discovers garlic, suddenly discovers spaghetti, Greek food, etc. So culturally, there's that huge redefinition of what it means to be Australian, and equally in the 70s, what it means to be Australian also starts to mean being part of Asia rather than part of Europe. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So moving on. Jane Carey, in her introduction, Creating White Australia, A New Perspective on Race, Whiteness and History, has said that the promulgation of White Australia policy in 1901 unequivocally demonstrated that quote-unquote whiteness was crucial to the constitution of the new Australian nation. And yet, historians have paid remarkably little attention to this in their studies of Australia's past. Do you think that whiteness and modernism can be used as a literary yardstick and the debate over whether either could properly represent the best in Australian culture or whether they were a sellout to European taste? Your opinion?
Well, the idea of whiteness, I suppose, is a sellout to European taste. It was white settlers who defined the modern nation state by federating what were British colonies with their own self-government. You can think of the White Australia policy in two ways. One is simple, straight out European white British racism. They thought they were superior to everybody else. So the idea of whiteness, the definition of whiteness, starts to change as the Irish, for example, were not thought of as white quite often. But then they become honorary whites, and then they become part of the white mainstream in Australia. And when the Italians and Greeks start coming in, well, they were of darker skin than most white Australians. So were they white or were they not? Culturally, obviously, we go back to Homer and Dante and what have you. So they were white in that sense, in the sense of being European. But ethnically, they were often looked down upon in the same way as the British looked down upon most Australians for a long time. So is that simple racism, I suppose, on the one hand. On the other hand, what was really driving a lot of the White Australia policy was simple economics. That, as I said, 1881, which is still only 30 years before Federation, you've only got 2 million people in the country. People are aware that China is not that far away, that India is not that far away. And in fact, it was this working class egalitarian ethos which partly drove the White Australian policy, because the workers were scared of competition from cheap, largely Asian labour, often brought in, of course, by British colonial interests, and in some cases actually brought into Australia. The Pacific Islanders were working the sugarcane in Queensland for virtually no pay. There were several projects to bring in Indian labour, what used to be called coolie labour in the 19th century, because it was cheap, because the landed gentry could run their farms for a better profit by not paying people as much. And the unions and so forth decided that the best way of protecting their own interests were to keep out that sort of working poor. So they're the two reasons for the White Australia policy, and gradually over time that starts to break down. But it's worth remembering that right from the very start, Australia was never completely white, that amongst the convicts there were people from Jamaica and the West Indies. There were certainly Indians in Australia from the 1880s, 1860s. The Afghans, as we called them, brought the camels in, ran the camels in the centre of Australia since 1860, and so forth. So politically, it was used to keep people out that we didn't want for a long, long time. Practically, that had loopholes according to expediency over time, and saw the end of it in the 1870s, which does lead to what we now call whiteness studies, which is the idea that the dominant white privileged people should inspect their own cultural privilege and start to ask questions about that and what they should do about it. That we all enjoy the privilege or the lifestyle we do because we're living on land that was purloined from somebody else, namely the Aboriginal population. So what are the responsibilities that arise from that, even if we ourselves are not guilty of doing nasty things in the past. This comes into novels, for example, like Kate Granville's Secret River, where she looks at colonizing history and the possibilities of positive white contact with Aboriginal people early on, and how it went bad pretty quickly for all sorts of reasons, mutual incomprehension amongst anything else. Gail Jones's novel Sorry, which is debating the responsibility of white Australians for the official government policy of taking brown children away from their parents right up until the 1960s, and sometimes even today, but not officially as part of policy anymore. It's important for the white population to examine its privilege and deconstruct itself and so forth, and to learn not to speak on behalf of underprivileged Aboriginal people, because they can do it themselves. There are limits to it. I mean, the limit is, I suppose, that the white people spend so much time thinking about themselves that they stop thinking about the realities of other people. So that remains an issue. Probably modernism is a longer lasting, more deeply rooted question to do with cultural practice. Modernism, of course, is drawn from Europe, but was used very much against Europe by a lot of writers because it was new. And Australia was a new country, so it could use modernity in order to talk back to the old world, the old decadent, world of Europe. And did so. But modernism is always this kind of double-edged sword. If you were writing a modernist novel, you could simply be seen as a bad copy of T.S. Eliot or Virginia Woolf, for example. But you could also be doing interesting things by bringing modernism into Australian writing, so that it was no longer just bush ballads or adventure romance yarns. That you can have a kind of vernacular modernism. I mean, these are questions that are also discussed in India, I know, and particularly in Indian English writing as well. But both of those things, whiteness and modernism, still remain very much at play within cultural practice in Australia. But again, they have different valencies, different values, depending on how they're practiced in specific circumstances. Okay, I'm going to skip very briefly over your next question, which is the cultural cringe, which we sort of touched on. Yeah. Simply put, it is this flip side of the same coin that from the colonial point of view, you think of nothing local can be valuable because the real values come from somewhere else, the metropolitan colonial imperial centre, right? The flip side of that is this modernist argument. We are the new nation, we are the future, we can do things afresh, make it new, and speak back to the old world because we have more promise. We can correct the sins of the past, and the evils of civilization, which produced the First World War, for example. And that idea of innocence, I suppose, runs through. The nasty side of it is the jingoistic nationalism, that we are good because we're Australian, because Australia is good. End of story.
So would you call that would you call that inverse aggressive nationalism?
Sorry? Reverse nationalism. Well, it is nationalism.
Yeah,
nationalism. Very narrow nationalism on its bad end of the spectrum, but a necessary phase, if you like, in cultural history, because you have to see yourself as worthwhile before you can develop your own range of cultural practices. Okay.
So we move on to my penultimate question. That is, there are two contradictory views about Australian literature being post-colonial literature. On the one hand, we have people like Nathaniel O'Reilly, who feel Australian literary study is marginalized within postcolonial studies. Even some postcolonial theorists like Robert J. C. Young have gone so far as to attempt to define postcolonialism in a manner that excludes settler colonies altogether and focuses exclusively on African, Caribbean, or South Asian literature. On the other hand, we have people like Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, who acknowledge that Australia is part of the postcolonial world. And also, according to Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffith, and Helen Tiffin's definition, all Australian literature is postcolonial, broadly speaking, since all Australian literature has been produced in a culture impacted by the imperial process. So what are your views on this debate about Australian literature being postcolonial literature or not?
Yeah, the first thing is it depends on how you define postcolonial. Most people think of it as post-colonial, meaning after colonialism, which I suspect is what Robert Young is talking about when he's talking about Africa and India and so forth. I mean, there were always two kinds of colonialism, what I think of as garrison colonialism and settler colonialism. So on the one hand, you have small populations of British controlling large populations of whoever was at hand in Nigeria or India or whatever, as opposed to Australia, to Canada, to South Africa, where numerically, for a long time at least, the population was British and ran the show. Certainly New Zealand, Canada, Australia. And in that sense, if you're defining post-colonial as after colonialism, then Australia, again, depending on who's talking to you, is not post-colonial. Certainly if you're an Aboriginal writer, Australia is not post-colonial because colonialism, the effects of colonialism are still with them. For the average Australian, you could argue, as Peter Carey argues in some of his novels, that we are simply recolonized by America, taking over from England, culturally, if not, economically or whatever. So dynamics of colonialism persist, shall we say. To that extent, Australia is still post-colonial in the sense of Ashcroft, Tiffin and Griffiths, that it is a dynamic of things that are set in play by colonialism. So we started out as a colony or set of colonies, and irrespective of independence, though we're not fully independent, we still have the Queen as our head of state. Practically we're independent, but economically, sometimes culturally, vestiges of colonialism or imperial dynamics of inequality persist. Discourses of inequality persist. Certainly internally they persist within multicultural practices and relations with Aboriginal peoples. So it's a yes and a no. The irony is Nathaniel O'Reilly's comment about Australia being marginalised within post-colonial practices, studies, which is probably true. The irony being that Australia and Canada particularly were the leaders of post-colonial studies when it began under the aegis of Commonwealth literary studies. And obviously Ashcroft, Griffiths and Tiffin all live in Australia and defined the field for quite some time. But like many things, once the Americans discover it, they tend to take it over. So the discourse often happens very much in and around American literature and hyphenated American identities these days, whereas once the Canadians and the Australians had a much more higher profile. So I probably agree with Nathaniel, although I don't think Australian literary studies have gone away. They still remain quite influential, certainly in terms of ecological issues and thinking about environmental humanities and so forth. Australia still has quite an influence internationally, I think, in that field. So yes, and just to save a bit of time, I'll move on to your last question, which is
final advice for students who wish to take up Australian literature as a research topic, especially.
Yeah, so if you good folk out there are interested in Australia, and increasingly Indians are because their cousins and their aunties and uncles live in Australia, by all means. I mean, I started out in my honours year getting interested in Indian writing, simply because it was different. You know, the attraction of something that's different, the intellectual challenge of dealing with something that's different is well worth, engaging with. Because it makes you think, it makes you stretch your reading and your cultural boundaries and so forth. The attraction has its own dangers because there are certain things which are easier if you're sitting outside looking on to see, and there are many things, of course, if you're outside looking on, you can't see, or you can't at least appreciate in the way that people who are inside appreciate. So you have to be a bit careful at the same time as you have a certain privileged objectivity, if you like. And how you deal with that is by reading as widely as possible, basically, and by not simply concentrating on key texts, but reading for context. This is part of the post-colonial literary studies wisdom that there is no literature that is pure in the sense of completely universal or completely free of historical influence. Everything is situated, as Gayatri Spivak has said. So you need to know a sense of context, and in that sense, read as widely as you can. Start with anthologies, something like this thing here, the Macmillan Anthology of Australian Literature, or this one happens to be published by Norton in America, if I can get it on the screen. Yeah, there we are. So it's another anthology of Australian literature. In Australia, it's called the PEN Anthology, the PEN. In America, just the Literature of Australia, edited by Nicholas Jose and many others, and contains the Aboriginal collection of literature as well. So that gives you historical material as well as pure literary material, and gives you a sense of where things fit and how locals at least make sense of them, and also who the major figures in the literary landscape might be. So that of course entails the need for access to resources, which is always a problem. But in your context, I can recommend going to libraries. The oldest collection, in fact, is in Mysore at C.D. Narasimha's estate, Vanyaloka. But nearer to you, there's a good collection at Bhagwan. There's an increasingly large collection at Bankura University, so catch the train and go and read there. If you're travelling around the countryside, there's another collection in Chennai at Madras University, specialising in Australian material. So you might need to just put a bit of extra effort in if you're dealing with this, but extra effort is part and parcel of comparative studies and studying anything that's just around the corner.
Definitely.
There are many online sites such as Trove, for example, and the National Library of Australia, which give you free access to newspapers and historical material. Even something like Project Gutenberg has a lot of the earlier Australian texts free on it. There's one called SETIS, which is run through Sydney University, SETIS, which has, again, free-to-air historical texts, and so on. So you can dig around and you can find all sorts of wonderful things if you're prepared to do the extra bit of hunting. So yes, by all means, get involved. There is life on the other side of the equator, and it's more than just cricket.
Yes. Yeah. And rugby and football. Yes.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for being with us today. I'll not bother you anymore.
Most
And
welcome.
to my audience, I'd like to say that we have come to the end of a very fruitful session, and I'm sure our listeners have been greatly benefited by your wisdom, sir. So we call it a day here, and I thank you once again, you,
Pleasure.
especially Paul Sharrad, and my audience. And I sign off today. So till we meet again, it's goodbye and take care.
Okay. Hasta la vista. See you later. Okay, thank you, sir. Yep. Okay. Thanks, sir. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, bye.
Bye for now. Thank you.